Hello, everybody. I believe we are live now. I'm going to wait just a couple of, I don't know, seconds, minutes, something like that. We're going to wait for just a moment while people kind of filter in. I think some people are going to get some notifications. I see there are 8 of you here, though, so thank you so much for joining us. If you could let me know how I sound in the chat, or just like let me know, say hi, say where you're from, something like this. I'd love to hear from you just before we actually get started talking about Stoicism and the dichotomy of control. I think we're going to do that another minute or so. So just let me know how I sound, and I look forward to hearing from you. So, okay, let's see. Get this stuff figured out. Okay, let me check one last thing before we actually dive into the content. All right, great. I hear for some people that I sound great. That's good. That's exactly what I wanted to hear. Thank you so much, everyone, for letting me know. Okay, so here's how this is basically going to work today. I've prepared basically some notes, and we'll talk about the Stoic idea of the dichotomy of control. And this is actually going to be the first live stream in kind of a series that I want to do, specifically about Stoic ideas and what I called in the title this like Stoic myths. Basically, I want to take some popular understandings of Stoicism, which are mostly fine, but maybe could use some tweaking, right? And try to actually go back to the source material, talk about those, and then maybe talk about them as if like they could actually apply to us, right? Because people who are interested in Stoicism typically want to know how to apply it. So we're going to be referencing some philosophers and stuff. I think it's going to be a lot of fun. And then, if you have questions in the chat or anything like that, just throw them in. Because once I'm done talking about this, we could just talk about some other stuff. I can answer some questions, do whatever. We can really make this what we will. But let's just go ahead and dive right into the basic ideas that I want to cover today, and then we'll go a little bit into the chat. So if you encounter any kind of online content about Stoicism, so let's say like Ryan Holiday would be a really popular example, but frankly, YouTube just has tons of them. Like there's just tons of people who want to talk about Stoicism. One of the things that you are going to encounter is this idea of the dichotomy of control. And one of the simplest ways that you will ever hear about the dichotomy of control is a slogan, which says that you should accept what you cannot control. One of the ways that you might have heard that slogan, by the way, is in a thumbnail from a video of mine where I talked about how to be a Stoic. So I've used the slogan myself too. However, it's not always easy to understand this slogan. And I think actually talking about what the philosophers themselves said is going to help us a good bit. Now, the rough idea is that Stoics think that we should only spend our time thinking about, being concerned about, acting on things that are within our control. Because if you make your happiness dependent on things that are not within your control, that's going to lead to frustration, negative emotions, generally a lack of happiness, and it's actually going to impede the things that matter the most. And we'll talk about what matters the most for the Stoics in just a moment, right? So you'll hear the phrase kind of described in a couple of ways, and I'm sure you've heard a few of these like this. Accept what you can't control, accept reality for what it is, let go of things that are outside of your control, don't worry about things that are outside of your control, learn to accept the world, and then base your happiness on yourself. These are all kind of equivalent ways of saying something like the Stoic idea of the dichotomy of control. So what I want to do is actually trace the history a little bit. We're going to go back to the sources. We're going to see what did those philosophers initially say about the dichotomy of control. And then we're going to talk a little bit about some modern problems there. I'm going to use some examples for us, and then we'll go on to the applications. Okay, guys? And if you have any questions, like I said, just throw them in the chat. I look forward to it. I'll do my best to look at it while also looking at my notes and looking at you. We'll figure it out as we go, right? So one of the problems that we have when we talk about Stoicism is that we have very, very few writings from the Greek Stoics. So the first Stoic is a guy named Zeno of Citium. I believe he studied with the Cynics. And then he goes on to found his own school under a porch called a Stoa. That's where they get the name. We have none of Zeno's writings. You can read this one book called The Lives of the Eminent Philosophers, like an ancient history of philosophers. And they list, 15 books that Zeno wrote. Not a single one of those survives to this day. And then we have some people who come after Zeno who are still Greek. And we have only fragments of their writings. So the only complete writings that we have are from Roman Stoics, many of whom, though, still wrote in Greek. It was like a learned language, though not all of them wrote in Greek. And so that's going to bring us to Epictetus. So I can't say that Epictetus was the one to initially formulate the idea of the dichotomy of control, but he does have a really nice statement of it. So if you read Epictetus's handbook, which is also called the Enchiridion or the guidebook, where there's lots of different ways of translating that, the very first passage is actually a statement of the dichotomy of control. And this is what Epictetus writes. Some things are within our power, while others are not. Within our power are opinion, motivation, desire, aversion, and in a word, whatever is of our own doing. Not within our power are our body, our property, reputation, office, and in a word, whatever is not of our own doing. So that's how Epictetus describes this. He doesn't use the phrase dichotomy of control, by the way. That's actually something that we later philosophers have used to kind of give a name to the principle. The Stoics, I don't think, actually use that name at all. Though there could be smaller writings or something that I'm not aware of. If you have corrections like that, that's another great thing to just throw into the chat for me. So what immediately jumps out to you when you hear what Epictetus wrote? So for me, I hear a couple of things kind of immediately jump out. One of them is that Epictetus, or at least his students who might have compiled the handbook out of his sayings, seem to think that this idea was foundational to Stoicism. So the Roman Stoics are very distinctive in that while we know the Greek Stoics talked about physics and they had made a division in their philosophy between physics, which actually includes metaphysics, logic, which is about the art of thinking, and ethics, the art of living. And the Roman Stoics only really talk about the ethics and they talk about the logic to kind of get to the ethics. They really emphasize the practical. And one of the things it seems that when Epictetus is writing the handbook is that idea of the dichotomy of control was going to be like foundational to Stoic ethics. So it was going to need to be said at the very beginning. You first need to learn the dichotomy of control before you can do anything else that's related to Stoicism. That's the first thing. The second is that the distinction, as Epictetus puts it, really hinges on this phrase within our power. And we can talk a little bit more about what in our power means, or not within our power as well. And then the third thing is that Epictetus does give us examples. And the examples really do help us try to understand what in our power and not within our power means. So the examples he gives are that the things that are in our power are all internal. They're all things that have to do with our minds, or the Stoics might also say the soul. So he talks about opinions, motivations, and desires. We could also probably say beliefs or judgments, passions, something like that. The things that are not within our power, though, he mentions things that are external to the body, external to the mind, and almost all of them are actually also things that sort of depend on social relations, like property. So we cannot control, property is not within our control, according to Epictetus, or reputation, or social status, some kind of social power, anything like that, not within our control. Those are all very different. There's lots of stuff we might think comes in the middle, too. So we'll talk about that as we go a little bit more into the Stoic idea of the dichotomy of control. Now, if you continued reading that passage, and by the way, in the description of this video, I link to a free translation of the Enchiridion by Epictetus. So if you want to read it later, you can look over it yourself. It's not that long. Epictetus will actually say things like, if you believe this principle, if you actually can only focus on the things that are within your control, no one can ever harm you. Actually, in one translation, uses the phrase impervious to harm. You will be impervious to harm because all of your happiness will only be dependent on things that you fully control. No one else can do anything about them. And it's like, he's like, this is the secret. This is the Stoic secret to being happy. So it'd be a pretty cool principle if we could actually understand it and we could actually talk about what it means. So let's move on a little bit here. Now, unfortunately, to talk about the dichotomy of control, we have to do a little bit of a detour to talk about what Stoics think is valuable. So we have to actually talk about value. And this is probably going to sound too broad. It's very broad. We could probably do an entire live stream just about that. And if you'd like to hear that or something, just let me know. But importantly, you really do need to understand like what the Stoics think matters or what they place any value on. And it actually all comes down to one thing, that the Stoics believe that the only thing that is valuable is virtue. So it's not money, It's not bodily health. It's not social relations or anything like that. It's virtue. And like literally everything else gets either cast into the category of bad, something that's actively bad, or a category that the Stoics called indifference. These are things that are strictly speaking not good or bad. And then of the indifference, you could say that some were preferred, meaning maybe they would help you or maybe they'd be nice to have. And then some of them were dispreferred, as in they would inhibit you in some way as you tried to live virtuously. But all of them, if we talk about them having value at all, it's because they relate to someone who is trying to live a virtuous life. So you can find examples, like once you realize that, once you have that principle, when you go and read other Stoics, like you can read Marcus Aurelius's Meditations, and you'll find Marcus is saying things like stand straight, not straightened. As in, don't be straightened by someone else. You should stand straight. And he's talking about living according to your own principles. And the principles that he's bringing out are the principles of virtue, which is actually why he'll then go on to say that social status and wealth don't matter at all, which is a very striking thing for someone who at the time was one of the wealthiest and certainly the most powerful man alive, right? He was the emperor of Rome, even before the Roman Empire starts to fall in the West, right? So he's doing, I think they'd already split or they were splitting, but you get the idea. He's an incredibly powerful figure, and he's saying, but social status, who cares? And in fact, sometimes in his journals, Marcus will talk as if he wishes he didn't have the responsibility of being emperor and instead wishes he could just devote his life to philosophy. And one explanation for that is that he thought that being a full-time philosopher would actually be the easiest way for him to pursue virtue or for him to live virtuously. Now, but like, what is virtue, right? So it's a very broad term. Probably a lot of people have associations with it, but in the ancient world, it had a kind of a definition. And while you will find that different schools of thought in the ancient world, like the Aristotelians, who are also called the Peripatetics, or the Platonists, who are also called the Academics, or the Epicureans, or the Cynics, or the Skeptics, they had different, maybe slightly different takes on what virtue was, but all of them kind of agreed on at least a common core of virtue, which is that, and we'll emphasize, just like what the Stoics said here, we could talk about other schools of thought and their virtue at some other time too. But basically, virtue, according to the Stoics, is living according to our rational nature. So Seneca will actually say that it's a perfected state of human reason, which is the distinctive feature of human beings in their mind. Diogenes Laertius, who's this ancient historian, he's the one who wrote the Lives of the Eminent Philosophers. I think in something he wrote, you can find a description of it as being a soul which has achieved perfect consistency. And actually, there is a line in the Meditations that I really love, and I forgot to write down the exact citation here, where Marcus says to himself, "You have not yet achieved simplicity." And what he means here is actually that he is still living like a fragmented life, where he is inconsistent with his ideals or living according to his ideals, depending on his circumstances. So in some context, he'll act virtuously. In some context, he'll act as if something else matters rather than virtue. So he has not achieved that Stoic simplicity that really is the ideal. If you are truly simple in the Stoic way, then your soul will always want to do what it ought to want, and you will always do what you ought to do. Now, virtue is it's kind of a goal. It's you can strive for it, and we can improve and we can get better, right? And it's difficult to achieve. Really importantly, for the Stoics, virtue is attainable for everybody. Now, this is a really important point, because some schools of thought in the ancient world did not think that virtue was attainable for everyone. Aristotle, who a lot of you might know is my favorite philosopher, I think has a defective view of whether or not virtue is attainable for everyone, because he seems to assume that there is a certain amount of wealth that you have to have in order to be virtuous. That's in part because Aristotle bases some of his virtues on the life in a city. And he wants he thinks that you need to be relatively wealthy in order to be able to give back to your city appropriately. This means that, for instance, so the Greeks had slaves. Slaves could not be virtuous in the Aristotelian sense. And I think that's a pretty bad consequence of a view. and that we need to think about how, like, whatever virtue is, it needs to be the sort of thing that is actually attainable for human beings. And the Stoics actually do emphasize that. And this is why I think it's a philosophy that could appeal to a Roman emperor at the exact same time that it was appealing to a Roman slave. So Marcus Aurelius is emperor of Rome. Epictetus was a slave. His name literally means like bought or acquired. He has a Greek name, but he was a Roman slave. And yet this philosophy seemed to be open to all of them. Okay, so now we have a rough idea of what the Stoics would say about value. The Stoics think that the only thing that's valuable is virtue, and that's going to help us circle back a little bit and understand the dichotomy of control. Okay, so if virtue is the only good, and it's the only thing with value, the dichotomy of control starts to make a little bit more sense to us, because what does it take to be virtuous? So the Stoics basically think that in order to be virtuous, you need to have a rough understanding of the world, and you need to be able to act rightly in the world. And so as we do that, our souls are habituated, which means that acting rightly becomes a habit. That's a very old Greek idea as well, straight from Aristotle. And actually acting rightly requires less willpower and less explicit thought. It just becomes a thing you can do. So all of the stuff that matters in the attainment of virtue are something that's internal to us, according to the Stoics. So our opinions, our life, our lives, our views about the world, our motivations, our desires, we can control all of those. That's how the Stoics viewed psychology. And so this also makes sense why Epictetus says that no one can ever hurt you if you understand this, because all of the things that actually really do matter are straight on like the side of control, and they allow you to pursue virtue. The stuff that doesn't matter, like social status, reputation, wealth, that stuff that you could continue to live even if you didn't have any of that, at least to some degree. Now you might wonder, doesn't some of that stuff lead to death eventually if you don't have enough food? And the Stoics have a view about death that we could talk about later too, which is roughly that they don't think that death is not that bad. That's hard, I think, to for us to totally make sense of, but the Stoics don't think death is that bad. So that kind of argument's not going to be super persuasive to us. Maybe I would love to hear this actually in the chat. If you think we could do a live stream on Stoics and what they would say about death, I think it'd be cool. I don't think it would do well as a video, but I think as a live stream, it could work really well. So if you want to hear that, do let me know, please. So all the things that Epictetus mentions are the things that we need, that are necessary for us to pursue virtue, like social status, and that is why we should focus totally on them. Now, there's a couple of problems that come up with the dichotomy of control. Some people have worries about it, whether or not it's a principle that we should actually accept as modern people. Are there good arguments against it? Anything like that. And I want to go through a couple of those, and we can talk about some of the problems, and then see where we go. So the first problem, and this is the one that I think I encounter in the wild the most, the people who actually will bring it up to me, is that the dichotomy of control seems to indicate that we should never think about or try to influence anything that's on the uncontrollable side. And the way this trend gets applied is that people start to think that Stoicism is very selfish or self-centered, or that it wouldn't be useful to people who were, say, victims of injustice. So at the most extreme, Stoicism might tell people that they just need to endure unjust circumstances and shouldn't ever actively try to better themselves or to better their circumstances or to help other people. That's the worry that people have. I think a good way of illustrating this is probably to talk about the history of slavery. That's in part because one of the great Stoics, Epictetus, one of the great Stoics, Epictetus, was a slave, like I mentioned. And so what would the Stoics say, Stoicism say to the slave who's being abused, right? Or about the awful fact, actually, just that one human being could own another human being in many different, social contexts. So I think actually I'm going to use an example that's not a Stoic to try to illustrate this a little bit. I'm going to talk about one of my heroes, someone who has made it onto my top 10 books of all time list, and that's Frederick Douglass. I think Frederick Douglass has a lot of moral insight for us. We can use him as our example. So, as we all know, Douglas was a slave, and in his autobiography, we hear about his experiences with different slave masters. He has various masters in that book, and some of them start off as like relatively kind, kinder than others. That is probably the way to put that. But always, they would eventually descend into cruelty when they needed to, or when they felt they needed to, or when they felt threatened or something. So, other masters though were brutal and cruel from the start. And no matter what, though, in cases there was malnourishment, there's the tearing apart of families, there's the threat of violence for someone who did not comply. So no matter what, it's just a bad situation to be in, right? And so, what would Stoicism say about Frederick Douglass's circumstances? So the first thing, and this all resonates really well with Douglass's book, is that there was always something that was under Frederick Douglass's control. So he emphasizes actually this himself, that no matter what, the cruel system that he was in and the cruel people he was enduring could not take away his ability to form his own opinions, his own beliefs, or anything like that. So he had the ability to act virtuously, even if he was put in incredibly difficult circumstances. It might be more difficult for him because of the pressure and things, but he was, he at least he always had the capacity. And they couldn't take his humanity. And actually, Douglass exercises this fact in a couple of ways. He still lives a life of the mind. He's thinking very deeply about his life. He still tries to act rightly. He tries to do right by his fellow slaves and tries to treat them well. He even secretly teaches himself to read so he can practice exercising his intellect. So, but what about everything else, right? There's still this question of like, what is Douglass supposed to do from the fact that he is owned by another human being? And I think that basically Douglass was right to run away, and Douglass was right to then advocate for the abolition of slavery basically for the rest of his life, right? And one of the facts that you have to understand here is that when the Stoics talk about virtue, they are also they name them. They give them names to the different virtues, and justice is one of the virtues. So it's actually in our nature, and it's actually part of our rational nature to want to act virtuously and to accomplish that desire, right? To actually act virtuously. So Douglass is actually pursuing justice to free his fellow slaves. Some of the other virtues, by the way, are like things like temperance and prudence and courage. All of these, actually, I think that you can find illustrations of Douglass in his book, which is one of the reasons it's so worth reading. So even in terrible circumstances, let me pull this back here. And I could actually see how someone could make the argument that if he hadn't spent so much of his life afterward trying to help free his fellow men, then actually he wouldn't have been acting virtuously. And so I think that Frederick Douglass is a great example of living kind of consistently and thinking about the things that he can control, right? But let me take actually one more example from the writings of Frederick Douglass so we can talk a bit more before going on to our next objection. So Douglass actually wrote an open letter in a magazine called The Liberator, or like a newspaper. And that letter was actually addressed to his former owner, a man named Thomas Auld. And it's withering if you read the whole thing. I have a link in the description as well. And you could read the whole thing. It's very powerful. But one of the things that's actually important is at the end of the letter, which is that Douglass says that I'm going to quote something kind of long here. He wrote, "I intend to make use of you as a weapon with which to assail the system of slavery, as a means of concentrating public attention on the system and deepening their horror of trafficking the souls and bodies of men. I shall make use of you as a means of exposing the character of the American church and clergy, and as a means of bringing this guilty nation with yourself to repentance." But then this is the key twist here. "In doing this, I entertain no malice towards you personally. There is no roof under which you would be more safe than mine, and there is nothing in my house which you might need for comfort, which I would not readily grant. Indeed, I should esteem it a privilege to set you an example as to how mankind ought to treat each other. I am your fellow man, but not your slave." And notice what Douglass does here, and this is why it's so devastating, actually, when you read it, is that Douglass is willing to write to his former slave master, a man who led to brutality, the tearing apart of his family, and said, you know what, if you were in my house, I wouldn't hurt you. Instead, I would show you what it is to be a good person. That that I would actually show you like an example of what humanity looks like. And I actually have to say, man, if I were reading that and I were Thomas Old, I think that would hurt more than like a threat. So you should read that letter. By the way, like I said, I linked it down below. Now, okay, so I think that helps us understand that actually, Stoicism does care about justice, does care about interpersonal relationships and things like that, but it does de-emphasize some other things, and we'll talk about those later. But let me bring up like a more philosophically minded objection to this, which is comes from William Irvine. If you haven't heard of William Irvine, he is the author of a book called A Guide to the Good Life. I believe the subject, like the subheading, is A Guide to the Art of Stoic Joy or something like that, or like the Lost Art of Stoic Joy, something like that. You'd be able to find it. I linked it down below if you want to take a look. So William Irvine actually worries that the dichotomy of control is a false dichotomy. Now, what does a false dichotomy mean here? Well, a dichotomy splits everything into two categories. And it's a false dichotomy if there are things that don't fall neatly into either category, if we need a third or a fourth or more categories to understand the world. And this is what Irvine writes in his book. And he says, consider, for example, my winning a tennis match. That this is not something over which I have complete control. No matter how much I practice and how hard I try, I might nevertheless lose a match. Nor is it something over which I have no control at all. Practicing a lot and trying hard may not guarantee that I will win, but they will certainly affect my chances of winning. My winning at tennis is therefore not an example of something which I have some control, but not complete control. So the worry that Irvine's bringing up basically is that what does it mean to say that you only have partial control of something? And Irvine actually will take this whole example, and he will say that we actually need to revise the dichotomy of control in a way that I do think is very useful. And he calls it the trichotomy. So he splits it into three categories. So there's a category of things we have total control over, like our opinions or our motivations, things like those internal states. And then we have the things that we have no control over. And then we have the stuff in the middle over which we have some control. And in fact, actually, when we have some control, we're going to have degrees of control, right? We're going to be able to affect some of those things more than others. And basically, I would just say that since we recognize there's significant variance in that second category, that we slightly revise the statement of the dichotomy of control in a way that makes it more readily applicable to our lives, which is just to say this. We recognize that in the world, there are some things which we have total control over, some things we have no control over. We're not going to focus on the things we have no control over. But for all those things in the middle, we will only focus on them to the degree in which we actually have some control. So your level of concern or care should be basically equal to the amount that you, your level of concern or care should be basically equal to how much control you actually have. Doing that seems to be like the Stoic recipe for not becoming frustrated, not wallowing in despair, or anything like that. Okay, I want to pause for a minute. One, I really need some water, so I'm going to drink this. But I would love, if you have questions down below, like say them now, write them down. I'll try to answer those a few, and then we'll talk about the application section next before we just broaden this into just a more general Q&A and discussion and things like that. So let's take, I don't know, a minute while I drink a little bit of this. Okay. So I saw one question that came up, which is about obesity, but also we could just generalize this to talk about health in general, how much control we have over our health, right? Actually, in a piece of writing I was doing for a book that I'm hoping to publish eventually, I mentioned physical and bodily health as one of the things that we have to talk about as things where we have some control, but at different times we have different amounts of control. So let's say that you are relatively able-bodied and born fairly healthy, and you're young, right? You have a larger degree of control over your health than other people do in those circumstances. And so it does make sense for you to sort of to tend to that, right? Bodily health is a preferred and different. according to the Stoics. And so we would want to we would want to concern ourselves at least a little bit. And it's nice to have bodily health and things like this. For other people, though, there are just going to be people who don't have as much control or have no control at all. Fate kind of has granted them a fairly bad hand, right? And it's really going to be a matter of particular circumstances and an analysis of like a lot of different facts, right? And so we should determine those in our own particular circumstances and then figure out what is the best thing for us doing moving forward, given the amount of control that we do believe that we have. That's like roughly what I would say. The next question that came up, actually, I think now I can actually show this. Drawing a line of partial versus complete control when it comes to mental health, similar to the question there. With mental health, I think especially, and I clarify here, I have a PhD in philosophy, not a psychologist, not a psychiatrist, not a doctor, but I can say this. For some mental conditions, like I've struggled with anxiety and depression in my life. I have some amount of control of that. Not that I can just will myself to not be depressed or something, but environmental factors really do heavily affect how I feel. And I have some control over that, and that helps. But also there's nothing unstoic or something about like seeing a therapist if you need to. But also there are going to be people who need medication, and that's to talk about with a professional, or something more serious treatment for more serious ailments, right? And again, it's just going to be a matter of determining it in your particular circumstances. Also, though, one Stoic virtue to keep in mind is prudence. Prudence is knowing sort of how to act rightly in practical situations. And part of being prudent is knowing when to ask for help. So part of being prudent is knowing that if you need to ask for help, you can do so. And then it's about figuring out actually who can help you in your circumstances. So those were great questions. Thank you for those. And I see one more here that's about Stoicism, or mentioned here. I think the matter of control needs a deep understanding of what is influence and also neurobiology. That's true. Like, right, our understanding of the mind, or not the mind, but the brain, is different than the Stoics because we have modern science. We've learned more about the brain. And also understanding about what influence is. I think we tend to think of the mind and the brain as much more significantly affected by external factors and environmental factors than I think the Stoics would. Marcus Aurelius will talk about retreating to his own mind, right? He'll talk about entering like a citadel, and calls his mind a citadel. And that's a very, he seems to think actually you could always do that. No matter what, you could just always retreat to the citadel. And that might emphasize a level of control that we'd really need to debate whether or not anyone actually has it, right? And part of that's an empirical matter. I will say, though, one of the things that is so interesting about Stoicism in the modern age is how many practitioners of cognitive behavioral therapy have drawn inspiration from Stoicism and thinking about something like the dichotomy of control. So this is a case where philosophers did seem to have at least real psychological insight. And so we were able to, go and learn more, or, actually say something about the human mind, even without modern neurobiology or something like that. All right, great. Thank you for those questions. If you have more questions, keep putting them in the chat. But let's talk about a couple of ways that we can apply this kind of Stoic thinking and the dichotomy of control and in our own lives. So the first one I want to talk about is social status. So the first thing to remember for the Stoics basically is that social status doesn't matter. Social status is not important. And it's not just the Stoics who would argue for this, by the way. The Neoplatonists like Boethius in the Constellation philosophy will argue that like reputation doesn't matter. Again, this is one of those things where because it could be useful, it could help you as you try to achieve your goals and things. They call it a preferred indifferent, but it's not as important as virtue. And the easy way to understand something being a preferred indifferent, by the way, is something that could help you as you pursue virtue. Maybe, but it doesn't actively inhibit you as you pursue virtue, but it's not strictly necessary to live a good life, according to the Stoics. So there are things that you can do to have. Now, let's think about the things that you could do to have a higher social status, though, right? The basics, the bare minimum things you can do are like to act kindly, to treat others with kindness, to act with justice, to actually help people get what is fair or what they are owed, to live up to your word, to act honestly, to not lie. All of these things are part of pursuing virtue. And other people who recognize that that is a part of pursuing virtue will actually then turn to you and say, like, they will think highly of you because of that, right? But it's not like everyone who has ever acted virtuously has been held in high regard or has had social status. We have celebrities who we particularly don't think of like as particularly great morally or speaking or something like this. Also, there are people who are unfairly maligned, right? And so what the Stoics would say is sometimes acting virtuously is going to get you social status. If so, that's great. If you don't act virtuously, though, no amount of social status could ever make up for it. And so the answer there is to just say, never trade off between the two. And really similar things are going to be here for our next, for the second application I want to talk about, which is that, which is wealth. Now, eventually, I really want to do a live stream about philosophy and wealth and like money, because it's a topic that I think everyone is obsessed with, and philosophers have had a lot to say about it in the past. So, and it would be especially interesting to look at like what the Stoics say and the Cynics and the Epicureans, the Peripatetics, and all these ancient philosophers. But we're just talking about the Stoics right now. So wealth, or just money in general, is again a preferred indifferent for the Stoics. But actually, some Stoics, like a Stoic I've been reading a lot of lately, I was recently reading, I think, everything we have of his writing, Musonius Rufus, and I'll talk more about him in the future on the channel, I promise. He actually argues for two things about money. First is that you should not compromise on virtue in order to be wealthy. That's the first thing Musonius would say. And that's because wealth, strictly speaking, doesn't have value. Virtue does. Why would you ever trade in something that has value to get something that has no value? That's the basic argument. But Rufus actually would go on and say something a little stronger, which is that having too much wealth is actually bad for the soul. He basically thinks that when you have too much wealth, you live in luxury. As you live in luxury, you actually become dependent on those things. He uses a phrase like turning soft or something like this. And he wants to say that a philosopher should not care about wealth, and in fact should be really worried about accumulating too much money, because it actually could inhibit his pursuit of virtue. It's the same way with social status, right? Any of those things that are preferred indifference, if you have them to a huge degree, it could actually make it harder for you to live a good life. And that's the basic Stoic view of money. When Musonius Rufus talks about how a philosopher should live, he says that there are two good ways for a philosopher to make money. One of them is to have students and to teach philosophy, but you can't always do that. And in fact, it would be better if all the philosophers went and became farmers, because your students could join you in the fields and you could do philosophy while you like planted wheat or whatever. I guess there wasn't a ton of no, Italy has something like that, but you get what I mean. You could just farm while you do philosophy. And he thought that was very noble because it attended to your basic needs while also allowing you to live a life of the mind. And he also argues that philosophers essentially should live in caves or really simple dwellings with very few luxuries or items that they need. They should find exactly what they need. He talks about how they should be cheaper. They should be okay to make. They shouldn't be too fancy. They should be easy to replace, because all of these things are functional and you shouldn't worry about anything else other than do they fulfill the function. That's the whole story for Rufus when he's talking about wealth. So the Stoic view of wealth really is probably that it's better to be, if not poor, then at least to not be rich. That's how the Stoics would talk about this, because a lot of that stuff's going to get in the way of you actually being virtuous. Epictetus, let me add this. Epictetus in his handbook writes about this as well, or it might be in the discourses. I'll find the citation later. And he basically says, show me a way to get money, and if I don't have to compromise on my ethics, I'll do it. But I won't compromise on that in order to on ethics in order to get money, because what would you rather have, wealth or a respected and trustworthy and kind friend? And he thinks obviously that you would want that friend rather than you would want the wealth. So we'd all strive to be that kind of friend, because that's the kind of friend that is actually more valuable than money to most people. Now, let me just say this last thing before I turn to more questions here in the chat. My original plan, by the way, was to speak for 20 minutes. We have gone to 40, so that's great. But just say one last thing. As we talk about Stoicism, I think it becomes very, very easy for us to really get really hard on ourselves or to hard on others. And I think this is another thing that Epictetus talks about, that it's really important, which is that if you have now decided like you want to care less about social status, you want to care less about money, you want to pursue virtue, every day before you go to bed, you start thinking, what did I do well and what did I not do well today? And then what does Epictetus say? Basically says, go to bed, wake up in the morning, get some rest, wake up refreshed, and then be ready to do better, right? That's what we're aiming to do. I mess up on this stuff all the time, right? I'm far from perfect. But we remind ourselves of these principles so that going forward, we can improve a little bit. Okay, I'm going to drink a little bit more water. I see there are more questions in the chat, and then we will talk about this. Okay. So I have a question. To what degree do Stoics believe in fate? I feel like things that are not in our control really come down to the idea of fate. This is a great question. In the writings of Marcus Aurelius, you see a very strong view of fate. In fact, Marcus seems to believe that basically there is a plan for everything. There is sort of a rational mind that guides the entire world, and that it controls everything that happens. And that actually, to be happy, you just need to accept that you are part of this big plan. And that as long as the whole universe is doing well, and it will because it's been guided by this rational structure, then you yourself are doing well. So basically, you do see a kind of emphasis on fate, on determinism, the idea that basically there are laws that govern the universe that fully explain the world. So you do find some of this in the Stoics. Do we need to believe in fate per se, other than just to say, well, I'm not sure we need to believe in fate per se to make this, but I feel like the things that are in our control, or like things that will happen basically to us that we do not control, right? Do we want to call that the universe? Do we want to call that fate? Do we want to call that chance? Well, that ends up being kind of irrelevant for the main Stoic point, I think. So I think our view of fate or chance or any of that could all kind of depend or kind of be modular here, and then we could just still endorse something like the dichotomy of control. That was a really nice question. So Lewis asked, the Stoics have been accused of conformism. Could you elaborate on that? I don't know why people would say Stoics are accused of conformism. It might be because a lot of online Stoics look the same, and a lot of them act the same, and so there might be something to that. However, I think that, for instance, when Marcus Aurelius talks about the need to be like bold in your principles and to stand up for those things and to speak honestly and truthfully, even when other people don't want to hear it, that's kind of anti-conformism, right? And so I think that you might think that it's conformist to always want to pursue virtue, but in a world where virtue is not always rewarded, in fact, it's not a conformist thing to do at all. It almost seems countercultural at times. I think we live in like a wealth-obsessed culture, right? And to say actually that wealth is not the most important thing, or even important, strictly speaking, that's actually, I think, kind of anti-conformist. But if you have more to say, Lewis, if you have more to say there, just put it down in the chat, and I'll try to follow up on that. Okay. So from Carl. I have a question about Stoicism. I've been reading the 48 Laws of Power and the Prince lately. I wonder where Machiavelli falls in the case of the Stoics. It's kind of the opposite. That's absolutely true. Machiavelli is the exact opposite of a Stoic. So in the Prince, basically, you see just like this ruthless approach to power. And the 48 Laws of Power is deeply inspired by the Prince and sort of Italian statecraft and things. And they want to pursue power whenever they can. And that's why if you read that 48 Laws of Power book, which I'm going to be honest here, I do not like that book. I do not think it has any Stoic insights, as some have said. I think when it says things like find ways to like use your friends, or don't depend on your friends, or it encourages deceit and things like this, or you should take credit for what other people have done and stuff like this. This is very unstoic. This is very unstoical, and I do not like it at all. So Machiavelli, total opposite of the Stoics. 48 Laws of Power is not a book I would recommend to someone who is serious about Stoicism. And just following Carl, also Sophocles has a quote that would rather fail with honor than succeed with fraud. And I think that's a good, very kind of Stoic-ish line. I think it's Musonius Rufus who says something like, imagine that you toil for something, eventually, and you achieve something honorable. Well, what will happen is the honor remains, but the toil disappears. But now imagine that, which means you're left with the thing that's valuable. And now imagine that you do something dishonorable in order to achieve pleasure. Well, pleasure is fleeting, and the pleasure will disappear, but the dishonor will remain. And so the choice clearly is to be, the choice there is to be honorable, even if it does require hard work. Lil Orris says, I really enjoyed Irvine's book. It served as useful gateway text. However, I'm really not sure about his trichotomy. For how I've understood Epictetus, the dichotomy seems more accurate. Well, I would love to hear more, when you say it seems more accurate. I do think that when you're interpreting Epictetus, you need to come up with some kind of explanation for, like, how do you make sense of things that are at least under partial control. Now, one interpretation of Epictetus might go like this. The things we should care about are the things that are totally in our control. And then anything that is even a little bit not in our control is just something we don't care, care about, right? We just like push into that. That's maybe a more extreme version of the principle. Maybe that's more faithful to Epictetus. I feel like that's a case where I'd have to actually look and see what scholars have said in response to Irvine or something like that. I think at least intuitively, the trichotomy makes it easier to apply, like in practice, but we'll see. Okay, let's see. Don't like the 48 balls power. Yep, that's true. So Carl's just mentioning that he was reading those books because he wants to know, like, how people use trace power or something like this. And look, if you want to read the 48 laws of power, you might learn something. I just don't think the 48 laws of power is a particularly good way to base your life. Something like this. Okay, we're gonna open this up a little more general because I see some other questions that are coming up. So I'll just address those until we end this stream. So Jared, do you initially memorize quotes? Like, do you have a box or container of quotes you've memorized? I don't have a box or container of quotes that I've memorized, but there's two sources. One of them is, hold on a second, I'm just gonna grab it from my desk. I keep this box on my desk, and that's where I write ideas down on note cards where I don't know what to do with them yet. But also, I've mentioned before that in having a commonplace book, I will actually write them down by hand. I don't memorize them forever, but what I've found is that the act of writing those things down by hand helps you understand, it helps you remember the majority of the quote a lot better. I keep hearing there are studies, but I don't know the studies myself, that writing things by hand actually writing will help with retention. I've never actually looked at the evidence of that. I'd like it to be true, but I've never looked into the evidence. I found in my own case, at least, it does help, right? And so that's just how you end up getting a gist for those. Though, if you're in my Discord, which, by the way, there's a link down to that in the description as well, we talked about that Musonius Rufus quote for a while in the Discord. So that also helped a lot. That it was just like on my mind. All right, what is your opinion on Ryan Holiday as a modern Stoic philosopher? So let me stick to the straightforward stuff, I think, here. Because actually, I'd like to meet Ryan one day. Ryan and I don't live very far away. I'd like to meet him one day. I think that what basically Ryan Holiday has done is taken some ideas from Stoicism and popularized them in a couple of books, right? Now, I have not read a ton of them. And I've only read a few of them. And some of them, I think, are really nice, like, gateways into getting you to read more Stoicism, right? Or reading more philosophy. And I think that's kind of his intention when he writes those books. And so what I'll say here is that I think he's like actually achieving his goals. Because I meet people reach out to me and tell me that they read Ryan Holiday and then they go and read more Stoicism, right? And that's fantastic. That's exactly what you want. And then they might go and read more philosophers as well, because they read Ryan Holiday 10 years ago or 5 years ago or whatever. Now they're reading Plato. Now they're reading Nietzsche. Now they're reading, they're reading all these philosophers. That's good. I want people to read philosophy. And I think that if Ryan Holiday is serving as a gateway into getting more people to read philosophy, then he is doing a great job. And that's great. I'd like to visit his bookstore. He owns a bookstore outside of Austin, and I would love to go. So, okay. Ooh, okay. Yeah. Besides Irvine, Massimo, what are other good books on Stoicism? Okay. I can answer this slightly. But I actually next week I have a longer video coming out that's like a guide to reading books about Stoicism that starts off at like the very beginning and gets you all the way to reading scholarly text about Stoicism. So I basically am going to tell you my favorite intro books to philosophy or to Stoic philosophy, which of the primary text I want you to read kind of in order, or at least the suggestion I have, and then 3 really kind of thicker, more dense scholarly texts that you can read about Stoicism. So I put a lot of work into that video, so I think you'll want to wait and actually just watch that like next week when it's finalized. But I will say, but let me answer just one note here about intros to Stoicism. And that is a book called Lessons in Stoicism by John Sellers. It's like 80 pages long. It is such a gentle introduction, but Sellers has been involved in an organization called Modern Stoicism that's been popularizing Stoic stuff for a while in a really nice way. And I think Sellers is someone who is definitely worth reading. I see someone else recommends Farnsworth, The Practicing Stoic. I haven't read that one. So one of the things that actually has kind of happened is that I've read more introductions to Stoicism in the last 6 months than I had ever read because I had never wanted to read the intros. I just read the primary text before that. And so I'm still getting a feel for all of the introductory books here. But honestly, the thing that's like the best way to learn about Stoicism is to read those primary texts, right? And this will come up in those videos as well. But let me just show two quick books. So this one is a book by Musonius Rufus called That One Should Disdain Hardships. This little volume, it's like 150 pages, is all that we have of Musonius Rufus. Musonius Rufus was the teacher of Epictetus. So if you like what Epictetus wrote, you should read Musonius Rufus as well. And I really like these. Each chapter is like a couple of pages, and it has basically it has like one theme. It'll like argue for one proposition or something like this. And I think it's just important to kind of spread out here, but Musonius Rufus is really nice. You could read this in an evening. I read it across like 2 days or something. And it's great. But also, and this will come up in that video too, maybe I'm spoiling too much, but at one point in like the Western world, at least, everyone was reading Seneca all the time. Seneca was the one we read constantly, and he was just huge. And as like Western education slightly shifted from the like classics and stuff, Seneca fell out of favor. But you should read, for instance, Seneca's Letters on Ethics. This is a new copy for me, the University of Chicago Press edition. It is the edition I recommend now. It's way better than the capstone one I showed off on the channel before because it actually has all of the moral letters or the letters on ethics. So just keep that, read Seneca and stuff like this. And you could read Seneca early on, even if you haven't read a bunch of introductions. And in fact, you could read Musonius Rufus early on with a bunch of introductions as well. Okay, let's see. Let me go through the chat really quickly. This is not about Stoicism, but do you read poetry? I read some poetry. In fact, actually in my Discord, I've been sharing people that now that I'm a new father, my son's 2 months old now, I read him poetry all the time. I find it's my most fun thing to read to him. So I do read, I'm reading more poetry now because I'm reading him, and I'm reading some Homer in my free time. What do I think about Agamben? Well, I don't know enough about Agamben to say. He's someone who's on my list, but never got around to. The way I was sort of educated in philosophy and stuff, we just didn't converge very often. Penguins. Yes, this is going to be uploaded and available for everybody. All of these Stoic series ones, there'll even be a playlist or something like that. So anybody who wants to watch can watch. So we will be able to share this with anyone. Okay, so this is a good question, Flirtshirts. How prominent was Stoicism in Rome? Was it the main philosophy of the time? I probably don't know enough about Roman history to answer this authoritatively, but I can tell you this. I don't think that Stoicism ever like overtook Rome. In fact, you get the sense that maybe Marcus Aurelius is like the outlier for loving Stoicism so much. Now, one thing though is that Romans loved Greek stuff. This is why Roman emperors would still read things in Greek. Greek was like the language of art and philosophy for a while. So you would get a lot of influences there. I don't know though if Stoicism was the one that really took off. Cynicism certainly wasn't. Epicureanism, no. But the influence of Aristotle and Plato is hard to ignore, especially once the Roman Empire converts to Christianity. The influence of Neoplatonism becomes much stronger because the sympathies between early Christian theology and Neoplatonism are very strong. Emmanuel is asking about reading more about Stoicism from the ancient proponents, but you don't know where to start. Epictetus, Marcus Aurelius, Seneca, anything like this. I'm going to address that in that forthcoming video. My latest recommendation is to not read Marcus Aurelius first. As I think about it, I think Marcus Aurelius should be put off for a little while. But Seneca's moral letters, also called the Letters from a Stoic or Letters on Ethics, great place to start. Epictetus, great place to start. But that Musonius Rufus book I've been plugging as well, also a great place to start. What I want to say to this kind of concern is there's no bad place to start here. Even if you read the Meditations first, you're fine. Just read more. There's no perfect place to start, and there's probably no bad place to start. So just pick them up and read. Now, there's some stuff by Seneca you wouldn't want to read, like Natural Questions, which is more about science. But read the Letters on Ethics. Read On the Shortness of Life by Seneca. That'll teach you a lot, too. Farnsworth to Montaigne. Montaigne's great. Montaigne's great. Not really Stoic, though you might see some influences, but just mentioning it here. He's great. Carl Johnson saying that reading Seneca's Letters from Stoic, because your English isn't your first language, I've been struggling to completely understand the text. Can I ask what your first language is, Carl? Because we might just need to find you an edition of that book that's just in your first language. If English is not your first language, you should probably try to read philosophy in your first language and not in English. There are exceptions. My wife's first language is not English, but she's fluent in English. She's getting a PhD in philosophy, speaking English. That's an exception, right? You should try to find one there. And honestly, Carl, I don't know like what your username would be or something. If you're in our Discord or something and you come in and you ask that question, we would try to answer that question for you and help you find an edition. And the link to the Discord's in the description, so anybody could join. Okay. Let's see. Is it true that Epictetus is a higher level compared to Seneca or Marcus Aurelius? I don't know if it's a higher level, but Marcus Aurelius, for instance, never was a teacher of philosophy. So it's much more raw and intimate and personal when he's writing. Epictetus, I think a lot of the stuff is actually compiled by his students, which is fairly normal in the ancient world. And so I could see where maybe it feels a bit more disconnected or something. Did you read the handbook, the Inquiry? I think that's the one that really does touch the soul a little bit more. So maybe give that a try. Seneca was the favorite philosopher of many philosophers. Seneca's great. Seneca's great. And so many people in history have loved Seneca. We should all read him at least a little bit. Okay. So cool to see 70 people here trying to make their world better. I totally agree. This is great. Okay, how can we practice what is in control and what isn't? I started reading philosophy a couple months ago. My main ideas is to get ideas, put them into practice. Thank you in advance. So this is a case where maybe going back and looking at the earlier parts of the live stream is going to help, where we go over what Epictetus teaches us. But the first thing that's going to hear is how do we practice it? Is like, how do we teach ourselves not to care about things that don't matter? And that's like the fundamental problem for a lot of us. How can we get ourselves not to care? Like, all of you have been really kind to me, and I really appreciate that in this chat. This has been so great. If I get like one negative comment on YouTube, I feel bad, right? And I care about that negative comment more than I care about a positive comment. But that's irrational, and I shouldn't let it bother me, right? And that's something I get to help myself practice, right? Is how do I not let myself get distracted by one bad comment or something? And so that just takes effort, but first work on trying not to care about the things that don't matter. And then you're going to find that actions follow your desires, right? So if we can change the things that we love or the things that we care about, how we act will change accordingly. Okay, so do we have plans on a live or a long video essay on a book that's influenced you? I'd love to watch a dissection of Anna Karenina or Dostoevsky. Now that I'm doing these live streams, and my plan is to maybe do them every week, if I can keep them up, but at least a couple times a month, I will do something like this, probably about Crime and Punishment. I would love to do one about Crime and Punishment. I would love to do one about The Dispossessed by Ursula K. Le Guin, and I'd love to do it about some philosophy books as well. I would love to do that. It's just that basically it wouldn't be a great YouTube video, but as a live, these would do a lot better, in the sense that people would watch, we'd have more fun, you'd be able to ask questions and stuff. Can you give a book about Stoic logic? Okay, I have some books on my back shelf, but I'd have to like kind of look in a weird way here. This might be the one. A.A. Long has a book called Hellenistic Philosophy, Stoics, Epicureans, and Skeptics. This book has some stuff about Stoic logic in it as well, I believe. And then there's a book called The Stoic Reader, published by Hackett. I'll try to update the description later with more links to books, okay? So that way people can find them. And then we can, you can find them there. They're going to help you focus on the logic a bit more. There's also a Stanford Encyclopedia article about Stoicism, which talks a lot about the logic, because it's actually focusing on ancient Stoicism and not so much modern applications like we often talk about. As you grow in property, how will you handle answering frequently recurring questions? You should not be afraid to ask basic questions. What I would say here is, if you have basic questions, ask them. If I've answered them before and I have a way to point you to the answer, I might just like direct you somewhere. Maybe I need like an FAQ eventually, but you should not worry about that. I will be happy to answer those questions. Yeah. Okay, well, this actually makes sense about the trichotomy. One of the ways we might look at it is that what you can do is break down the things that are partially in control into the parts that are totally in our control and the parts that aren't in our control at all. And eventually we'll be able to reduce it down. If that's the interpretation, I can see it. I'd have to think a little bit more. I'm not too quick on my feet for stuff like this, but that's good. English is my fourth language, as Turkmani, which is very rare. Okay, I see. Yeah, that one's hard. We could help you try to find something, but it'd be hard. But we try our best. Yeah. Some books for beginners from Aristotle and Socrates. Well, with Socrates, we have none of his writing because he didn't write anything. We have Plato, and it's over on the other shelf, so I'm not going to go grab it. Buy Plato's complete works if you can afford it. It's $50 for a hardback, at least in the US. If not, there are good translations online from like institutions like MIT and stuff, right? Just find those and read the dialogues. Just give that a shot. With Aristotle, the easiest thing to read, in my opinion, is the Nicomachean Ethics. So we can, you can start there. That's harder though. Aristotle is harder to read than Plato, in my opinion, other than some of Plato's works like the Timaeus, which is very difficult. And honestly, most people could skip it. Oh, how influential were Aristotle, Plato, Socrates, Stoicism? So you might think of it more as more of like a family tree. This is where Socrates really marks a turning point in Greek philosophy. We call all the philosophers that came before Socrates in Greece just the pre-Socratics. That's how like Socrates is that important. And so Socrates is like super important. And then you get Plato, who kind of codifies some Socratic thinking and then puts his own spin on it. And then Aristotle is his student. And then you have other students of Plato, and they basically just form these like branching trees. In I believe in Massimo Pigliucci's book on how to be a Stoic, he has a little family tree. And all of them take something from Plato. All of them take something from Socrates. And then they start diverging on details. So for instance, the Cynics say that no material wealth matters at all. It has no value whatsoever, where the Stoics call it a preferred indifferent. And so the Cynics lived in intentional poverty, so that's a little bit different there. Someone else suggests, like, for someone who's learning a language there, is just to get more familiar with philosophy as you're reading it in English. That's certainly true. Just find more text and to work with it. Keep in mind, if you are reading English philosophy as a non-English non-native speaker of English, it's going to be hard. Hard things are often worth doing, And I really commend you for that practice. Like, it can be very good. But it's going to take work, and just reading more philosophy is going to make that easier. So hopefully, yeah. So, this is a kind of meta question. Do you think YouTube algorithms give a boom to Stoicism? Yeah, absolutely. If you talk about Stoicism, you get the algorithm loves it because people love it. It's a name of a philosophy that people recognize. Fundamentally, the algorithm is just the audience, and the reason there is that people have come to think of Stoicism as something that they could rely on or think about. What I like to do is basically meet people where they are. I know people are interested in Stoicism and stuff, then bring them into talking about Stoicism, and then talk about other kinds of philosophy as well. Do you think it's immoral to become a hermit and live in solitude with books? Do we have an obligation toward the world to engage in it? I think that you have an obligation to anyone you encounter, right? If someone told me that like the world was just too much for them and they wanted to go live in the woods, and they wanted to go and focus on making the world a better place in their very small sphere of influence, I have a hard time condemning them for that. But there is going to be an argument that basically that while there is injustice in the world, or while there are other people suffering, we should try to alleviate that. And those two things are difficult to balance. I'd have to think about it more before I said a lot more about that, but it's a very good question. Let's see. Ooh, how you built your library? How do you get to a full-time job and all that, and the time to read? So my reading has gone down since I had a baby. It's gotten a lot slower since I had a baby. The reason I'm able to build up this library and read these books is, one, going to grad school teaches you how to read a lot faster. You just end up reading a lot more, and you just become much faster at reading comprehensively and things. The second thing is that I watched like some TV right after my son was born because I was up late at night a lot. I watched Silo on Apple TV. By the way, I thought it was good, but I haven't watched any TV in a really long time. I used to really love Succession. I never watched the final season because I just don't watch TV because I can't regulate my desire to watch TV. I used to love certain video games as well. I don't play any of them anymore. Like, I love the game Stardew Valley. And I swear, if I started playing it, I would play for 12 hours and I would never do any reading. What I've had to find is that I have to cut myself off from those things if I want to focus on what I think really matters, which for me is reading. Also, the Discord is lit. Definitely. Our Discord's great. It's so friendly. We just talk about philosophy. We talk about books. It's just so much fun. Let's see. You read Wittgenstein's remarks on color and very much enjoyed it as an art student. Could you give a similar recommendation? Philosophy of sound or color? I'd have to think about it. Maybe in the future I'd be able to answer this. I'm sorry, I can't think of one off the top of my head. One thing that bugs me about the philosophy of perception stuff, and this is something that philosophers have told me before we work in it, everyone talks about color. Nobody talks about sound. But by contrast, nobody talks about sound. It's such a strange thing. Okay, key difference between Aristotle's ethics and Stoicism. So the big difference, one of the big differences is that Aristotle thinks you need a certain amount of wealth to be virtuous, because he's putting it in the context of like living in a Greek polis, right? In a Greek city. And he has a kind of sense of magnanimity, or like actually like building statues is like it's a virtuous act in Aristotle's mind, because he's very civically minded. The Stoics don't seem to care about that stuff nearly as much. There's more overlap than there's more similarity than there is dissimilarity, is what I would say. But there are important differences. And again, Aristotle doesn't think that everyone can be virtuous, because he thinks you need money and you need a certain amount of social power to do it. You mentioned I'm currently reading some Indian and Chinese philosophy. That slowed down more, and I need to get back to it. I plan on making a video about it, or doing something. It might be a good live stream as well, like my experience branching out into Chinese and Indian philosophy. My Discord is also doing a live stream, not a live stream, a reading group about Chinese philosophy, and I pop in every once in a while. They asked me some questions about the difference between Taoism and Stoicism, which is a lot of fun, but they had to explain Taoism to me so that then I could comment about the differences. Let's see. Do you think as a society that we're so back or it's so over? I don't actually quite understand the question. If you clarify that question for me a little bit, maybe I can answer it. Can you use about Stoic ethics? So the best things for Stoic ethics is the Roman Stoics that we've been talking about. If you read those books, you're reading Stoic ethics. It's all about practical action. Thank you very much for saying that. Okay. I heard that Stoic philosophy was influenced by Indian philosophy, in particular Buddhism. I don't know anything about that history. I'm a little skeptical just because of the geography, but I could be totally wrong. If someone had stuff about that, I would love to see. Let's see. Hold on one second. I just need to check 1 second, folks. So let me banter for a moment while I check this. I'm loving this. This has been really great. Oh, okay. This is a question here. Who did I marry in Stardew Valley? Abigail. I almost always married Abigail. Too bad your live isn't available through your Facebook page. I don't have a Facebook page. So if there is a Facebook page with my content on it, it's not me. So that's something I want to look into. Yeah. What is the benefit of learning Latin and Greek for studying Stoicism? Marcus Aurelius was bilingual, I believe. He was. He could speak and read Latin and Greek. If you like to read things in the original source languages, which can be very powerful, then they're good, right? I'm working on teaching myself Greek again because I failed to do that at one point in my life, and I'd like to succeed at it. So, yeah, it is valuable. So the reason that Roman Stoicism is more popular than Greek Stoicism is that we actually have the Roman Stoics writings. We only have fragments of the Greek Stoics, and we don't have any of the earliest Greek Stoics. That's the big problem there. We just don't have access to it. Any philosophy books about the rule of law? I don't know anything like that, other than like you read John Rawls or you read Robert Nozick or something like that. But I don't know. I don't know if I have tons to think about there. Okay. Well, it looks like we are basically running to a close on the questions. So let's just hang out for like another minute. If there are more questions, I'll be happy to talk about them, and we can do that. But we've been going for over an hour, and we could end pretty soon. So yeah. Okay. I think I'm going to get another question here. Can you explain in simple words what is existentialism? Existentialism is hard to explain in simple words. I could probably just tell you that there are just read Sartre and stuff like this. And that's best to understand it. I don't actually understand like what are the core features of existentialism. VMA Mix, I think you were trying to share the Facebook profile for me, but it doesn't show up. I think that's because YouTube hides stuff. I will go search for it. Thank you for bringing it to my attention, though. Okay, I really appreciate that. Okay, cool. I think we're going to just call it quits then, because we have been doing it for a little while. I'm losing my voice, and I have to go and help my wife with the baby. That would be a very good thing for me to do. All right. I hope this live was as fruitful to you as it was for us. It really was. I really enjoyed this. I look forward to seeing everybody next week if you have time, and we'll be talking about something else. I'm not totally sure what we're going to talk about. I've got a few ideas there, and I got to write the notes up, but I'll announce that in the next few days. So thank you, everyone, for joining. This was great. Take care.